Let's go see the doctor, sir,
Tina said to her husband. Mr. David closed the door of his car and locked it up. He peeped through the glasses to see if he would see even a glimpse of the uniform, but nothing. He joined his wife to go see the doctor. Mr. David and Tina entered into the doctor's office. They had come to ask him if Naomi was okay. The doctor told them they were free to go back with Naomi. He only told them what to avoid if they wanted her to get better quickly.
Don't allow your daughter be around things that will make her unhappy. She needs to be happy always to help her heal faster,
the doctor said to Mr. David and Tina. Mr. David wanted to tell the doctor that Naomi wasn't theirs, but it felt as if something asked him not to. Mr. David thanked the doctor and paid all the necessary bills which were in the receipt. He also made sure he bought the necessary drugs from the pharmacy. Then he left the hospital with his wife and Naomi. That night after dinner, Mr. David retired to bed with his wife Tina. They took Naomi into Pascal's room. It was still intact after 2 years Pascal passed away. None of Pascal's belongings were thrown away or given out. It was as if he never left. Tina always took her time to arrange the room and keep it clean. Whenever she felt the need to be with a child, she goes in there.
Morning.
Tina called her husband as they both lay on the bed. Yes, dear, Mr. David answered.
Will you still go looking for a parent tomorrow?
Tina asked. Mr. David took a while. Then he heaved a sigh. I don't know, he said, shaking his head. I'm so confused. It seems like something is keeping me from finding the little girl's parent, and I can't just explain it, Mr. David said, staring at the ceiling.
I know it will sound selfish, but why don't we keep her? For her to have encountered an accident means that her parents are not rich enough. We may give her back and they won't be able to take care of her health issues. Let's keep her till she fully recovers and regain her memory,
Tina said. Do you think giving her up after getting attached is going to be easy? Mr. David asked, moving his gaze to his wife.
I don't know,
Tina answered and held her husband. It was actually a long night for the couple. Mr. David kept trying to figure out what had made the school uniform to disappear, till the straight arms of sleep took them off. The next day, Mr. David woke very early and went to check on Naomi. She was still sleeping peacefully. He got ready for work and left the house. Tina stayed at home because she wanted to keep an eye on Naomi for a while. Naomi was having her breakfast when Deborah walked in after Tina opened the door for her. She had called Tina to ask about Naomi, and Tina told her she would be at home the next day. Naomi greeted Deborah in a little sweet voice, which was almost inaudible. Deborah responded. Deborah dragged Tina by her hand out of where Naomi was seated. She asked her softly, "What is your plan with Naomi?" since she was already getting better. Tina told Deborah that they plan on keeping Naomi till she recovers fully. I knew it, I saw the way you were feeding that little girl at the hospital. But let me tell you, Tina, you are my friend and I can't give you a bad advice. Return this little girl to her parents. You are a mother and you know what you went through when you lost Pascal.
Don't talk about Pascal,
Tina said immediately, cutting off words from Deborah.
How did you Instead, we find her parent. She can't even remember herself. She needs intensive care, and I'm going to give it to her. This has nothing to do with Pascal,
Tina said, and a tear rolled down her cheek. Mommy, Mommy, Naomi's sweet little voice called out to Sandra. Sandra turned quickly, and there was Naomi with her school uniform smiling at her. She was holding her lunchbox, and her smile was so cute as she shook her head slowly from left to right, showing a bit of her teeth. Sandra spread her arms wide for Naomi to run into them with so much joy. Naomi sprinted forward towards Sandra. Suddenly, an invisible force stopped Naomi from reaching out to Sandra. Sandra couldn't explain what was happening. She then tried running towards Naomi, but she couldn't. The invisible force then took the form of a man. It held Naomi and dragged her backwards, while Naomi kept crying for her mother. Give me my child. Give me Naomi back, please. She's all I have. Sandra kept shouting and crying out bitterly. She's never coming back to you, the man without a face said in a coarse voice. Naomi suddenly stopped crying. The man smiled at her and she smiled back. The man held Naomi by her hand and walked away with her. Sandra couldn't understand what was going on. She tried running after them, but she slipped and fell down. Naomi! Naomi! Sandra shouted as tears ran down her cheeks. Sandra! Sandra! Mr. Bright kept calling and tapping Sandra. Sandra! Sandra woke up and it was just a dream. It felt so real to her. He said he won't give her back to me. He took her. They took my daughter. They took Naomi. Please get her back, Sandra cried out, sobbing bitterly. Mr. Bright held his wife tightly and tried consoling her. Who took our daughter? Did you see any face? He asked, still holding her. No, I didn't see any face. He had no face, he said. He said my daughter is no longer mine. He took my daughter. He took Naomi, Sandra said and continued sobbing. Mr. Bright kept consoling his wife, who won't stop crying. She stood up and tried leaving the room, but Mr. Bright won't let her. He doesn't trust her judgment anymore. She was slowly losing it. He dragged her slowly back to the bed. Mr. Bright didn't know who to call at such time. He decided to call his mother, since Sandra's mother was no more. Mr. Bright's mother picked up the call. She tried consoling Sandra over the phone. Ever since Naomi got missing, she has always called to know if there was an update. Mr. Bright told his mother about Sandra's dream. He told her about the faceless man Sandra saw in her dream that took Naomi. Did you say you saw a faceless man? Mr. Bright's mother asked over the phone. Yes, she said the man was faceless. Hello, Mama, Mr. Bright kept saying over the phone without getting a response. Mr. David was seated in his office, but his mind was not at rest. He kept thinking about what he had discussed with his wife. He closed his laptop, stood up, and began to pace around inside his office. A business call came into his phone. He declined the call. He called his secretary telling her to take charge because he doesn't want to entertain any business calls. Mr. David really wanted to find Naomi's spirit, but he couldn't tell what was really stopping him. He doesn't want to get attached to Naomi because giving her up would be more difficult. Keeping her won't also be a good decision, but he could already feel the love his wife has for Naomi. Things got confusing for Mr. David. His mind went back to the uniform that got missing and appeared back inside his car. He had arrived at the hospital but didn't enter because of a distress call from his wife. Nothing was really wrong with Naomi, and he drove all the way back. Denying his wife the right to console herself from the death of their only child, which she hasn't grown over, or taking back the child to the parents of the child who were going through a lot because of their missing child. The decision was getting tougher for Mr. David. The doctor has also said Naomi stood a chance of losing her memory forever. What if Naomi loses her memory forever? Mr. David asked himself with deep thought. I'm so sorry, Tina. I know what you're thinking. You will call me a bad friend for talking to you about all this. I just feel the little girl's parents need to know that her daughter is okay. I really can't help it if it was my daughter that was knocked down. The pains of losing a child is... Please stop it, Deborah. Please, can you leave my house, please? I plead with you. Don't open old wounds, Debbie. Just go. Tina pleaded, trying to hold in the building tears. It's okay. I'll go, Deborah said and picked up her handbag. She turned and looked at Naomi, who was innocently eating slowly. Then she looked at her friend, Tina, who was walking her out of the house. I'm sorry, Tina. Pascal, just leave, please, Tina said, holding her hands together and cutting Deborah's words. As soon as Deborah left the house, Tina ran into Pascal's room. She shut the door behind her and then lay on his bed. Sweet memories she had shared with her son came playing inside her mind. Looking around inside the room, Tina could recall a time with Pascal just as if it was yesterday. Then it fast-forwarded to the particular day she had lost Pascal at the hospital. All the good Pascal did to his friends who had nothing, and he was still taken from her without any replacement. Tina lay on Pascal's bed holding his bedspread and crying out her eyes. She only wished her son was still alive.
Why did you take me through good? Why did you bring that into my life? Why are you torturing me? Do I really deserve all this pain?
Tina asked, crying her eyes out. The more she tried to hold in the tears, the more it streamed down her cheeks. Hello, Mama. Are you still there? Mr. Bright was still trying to talk to his mother. My son, I don't think this is what we can talk about over on the phone. Can you come back to the village tomorrow with your wife? I think there's something I need to show you. Mama, you are really making me and my wife anxious. Tell me what you know about our dream and the faceless man, please. Mr. Bright said, It's a long story, my son. Please come back to the village as soon as possible. Mr. Bright slowly brought the phone down from his ears and hung up the call. He looked at his wife, who seemed more worried than he is. Sleep didn't go through their eyes again, as they kept wondering why Mama would ask them to come back to the village and who the faceless man was. Mr. Bright and his wife, Sandra, began preparing for their impromptu travel to the village. When they were done, they left their house very early. Mr. Bright's village was just a few hours' journey from the city. When they arrived at the village, his mother, Miran, was seated outside on a bench like she has been waiting for them. Sandra greeted her mother-in-law with tears running down her cheeks. She stood up from the little bench she was sitting on and hugged Sandra. Since it was an emergency matter, Miran told them to sit with her on the little bench she sat on outside. Mama, please, I and my wife are curious. Tell us about the faceless man and what he wants with our little princess. Miran heaved a sigh and then turned towards her son. My son, many years ago, I was heavily pregnant for you when my late husband, your father, was into a land dispute with 3 men. They all claimed ownership of your father's land. Your father called his uncles to help him, but they all turned their back on him. I pleaded with your father to let the lands go, but he told me he won't let his father's sweat to be in vain. When all hopes were beginning to fade away, your father took me to the land at night. In front of the biggest tree inside the land, your father made a promise to the tree. He told the tree that if he takes over the land as the rightful owner, he was going to dedicate all his future generations to it, starting from the one I had in my womb. Then your father cut himself with a sharp object and rubbed the blood on the trunk of the tree. Those who had come to drag the land with your father came begging him. They said that a faceless being was chasing them all around, even in their dreams. One of them died because he tried to stay and continue fighting. Your father took over all the land for himself. When you were born, your father dedicated you to the tree. It's been so many years your father died, and I had already forgotten about it. When you called me and told me about the faceless man in your wife's dream, it took me down the memory lane. My son, I think it was the faceless man that caused the accident which Naomi got involved in. I think he wants to take the child away from you and your wife for not dedicating her to him, Miran said in a convincing voice. It all began to make sense to Mr. Bright. He couldn't explain how he had suddenly forgotten to take his daughter back from school. He always went earlier than the normal time. Neither could Sandra explain why there was a sudden traffic that particular day and how her phone got stolen. None of them remembered to call the school to tell them they would be coming later than usual. Naomi was a very smart girl, and her leaving the school without waiting for them also made sense. Of all the hospitals in the city, his daughter was transferred to another city, which they knew not about. Even Mr. Bright began to understand why the man that had knocked down his daughter would come and meet them in the hospital and go back. How can a tree torment my life? Where was the tree when I and my wife were looking for a child? After waiting on God for a child, Mama, you are telling me a tree is in charge of my daughter's disappearance. You and Papa dedicated me to a tree, Mr. Bright said, fuming with anger. He stood up from the bench. He entered into the house and came out with a machete. I'm going to bring that tree down today. I want you to show me its power, he said and walked out with a machete. Miran begged her son not to cause any harm to the tree. She told him to appease for it to bring back their daughter. But Mr. Bright had already made up his mind. He arrived where the tree was and yelled at the tree and started cutting the tree. By the time Sandra and Miran could get to where Mr. Bright was, he had already started digging his machete into the tree. After a few minutes of cutting into the tree, Mr. Bright's hand began to shake. He adjusted his hand and continued cutting. Then his hand started shaking vigorously. The machete fell off from his hand. Mr. Bright was just staring at his hands, and the sweat which gathered all over his face started dropping on the ground. His legs began to tremble, and he started breathing heavily. He turned to look at his wife and his mother, who was staring at him. Then he fell down and fainted. Mommy, why are you crying? a little voice asked Tina. Tina turned to see who was calling her, and it was her dead son, Pascal. She hugged him and tears kept streaming down her cheeks. He wiped her tears with his fingers.
Why did you leave me? Why did you allow Mommy to suffer?
Tina kept asking Pascal, who just kept staring at her.
Please promise me you won't leave again.
Tina said to Pascal as she held his hands. I won't. Pascal answered slowly and shook his head from left to right. Tina smiled with so much happiness, she wiped her tears. Come with me. There is someone I need to show you. We have a sister for you, Tina said to Pascal and went with him towards the living room. But surprisingly, Naomi was not on the dining. No one was in the sitting room. She was just here earlier, Tina said, pointing towards the dining. Then she turned to look at who she was holding, and it was Naomi, and she was just staring at her. Oh my God, I'm finished. Sandra shouted and ran towards her husband with Miran. Mr. Bright was on the floor shaking. His eyes were opened and he just lay there shaking and staring at his wife. Sandra cried out bitterly and tears ran down her cheeks. Don't do this to me. Stand up, please. You are making me scared. Please get up, Sandra said in tears, trying to lift her husband up with Mama, but they couldn't. Miran ran out and saw some guys passing by. She asked for their help to lift her son from the ground. The guys saw Mr. Bright's condition and they quickly carried him up and took him to Miran's house as instructed. Mr. Bright was carried into the house and kept on the old bed inside the room. Miran thanked the guys and they left wondering what must have kept Mr. Bright in such condition inside his own land. Sandra sat on the bed beside her husband, just looking at him sent tears running down her cheeks. We came here to look for a solution. We came here because of Naomi. Why didn't you listen to Mama? I just hope we will see our charming princess again. I don't want to think about it. Just get up, let's look for a solution together. Sandra continued saying with tears. Mr. Bright just lay on the bed, unable to speak. Couldn't even lift a finger up. He was completely paralyzed. He just continued looking at his wife and tears rolled down from the side of his eyes. Tears ran down Miran's cheek too. It'd been so many decades and she had never remembered about the faceless man. She never knew we still existed. She was confused and didn't know what to do. She doesn't know how her husband had discovered the powers in the tree. It just took her there the day it took an oath. She doesn't know what she can do to appease the tree for what her son had done. Mama, what should we do? I don't want to lose my husband, please, Sandra said, still shedding tears. I don't think I know of any native doctor who is as strong as the faceless man. I think we need to look for a pastor who can help pray against this deity my late husband created for himself, Miran said, looking at her son who was suffering. Mama, tell me the nearest church so I can go immediately. I don't want my husband to die. I don't want him to die, Sandra said in tears. Miran directed Sandra to one church at the junction. It was quite a big church. Sandra wiped her tears and ran towards the church. When she arrived, she was lucky to meet with the senior pastor inside the church. He was manipulating his phone. Sandra ran inside with tears. She fell at the pastor's feet and told him the short story about how her husband had gone to cut down a tree and got paralyzed. The pastor told Sandra to wipe her tears because she was at the right place. But before they leave, she had to pay deliverance and consultation fee. Sandra was ready to pay anything she could afford so that her husband can be well again. She transferred some amount of money into the church account in tears. When she was done, the pastor called 2 other pastors and left with them to Mr. Bright's house. After seeing Mr. Bright's condition, he asked to be taken to the evil tree which had paralyzed Mr. Bright. Sandra took the pastors to the tree. When they arrived, the pastor said some words of prayer. He gave his Bible to a fellow pastor and picked up the machete from the ground. Something unexpected happened. Why do I have a feeling that I have to keep Naomi as mine? Why can't I feel the pain her parents must be going through? Why can't I reach a conclusion? Will I really be able to give Naomi up if she becomes part of my family? Mr. David asked, placing his hands on his head. Mr. David asked, placing his hands on his head. He went back to his seat, but yet it wasn't comfortable. He stood up and decided to go back home. He packed his things and left with his briefcase. Ever since the uniform disappeared from his car, it has not appeared again. Maybe his son Pascal doesn't want Naomi to be taken back, Mr. David thought to himself as he drove back home. Mr. David got back home. He opened the door slowly with a sad face. No one was in the sitting room, so Mr. David decided to check for his wife and Naomi inside Pascal's room. He could overhear his wife talking with someone, and her voice was filled with happiness. Curious to know what was making his wife sound so happy, he opened the door and it was Pascal. "Where have you been, son? Why did you leave us all alone?" Mr. David asked with a tear rolling down his cheek. Both Mr. David and Tina were so happy. "I'm going to take you to your favorite place," Mr. David said to Pascal out of joy. Pascal just stood there staring at him and Tina. Mr. David carried Pascal and started walking towards his car. Tina immediately followed, saying they won't leave her alone at home. She wanted to join in the fun. Mr. David drove off to Pascal's favorite play park. The place was crowded with kids that have also come with their parents. Mr. David and Tina did well to hold Pascal tight in order not to let him out of their sight. Mr. David left Tina and Pascal to go get them things. A parent from Pascal's school had come with her daughter and son to the park. She saw Tina holding a little girl. She decided to go ask her if she had adopted a child. Tina saw the lady and let go of Naomi's hand. She wanted to greet the lady warmly and with joy. A little boy came running into Naomi. He was being chased by a playmate. He had pushed Naomi so hard that she fell down and her head slammed on the ground. That was when Tina's eyes opened. It has been Naomi all along, who they had been seeing as Pascal. Naomi, who was just coming from a breast surgery, hitting her head on the ground. Tina let out a loud cry and tried lifting Naomi up. The pastor went closer to the tree with the machete he had picked up. He was filled with fear because of Mr. Bright, who had made a cut on the tree, was paralyzed. But as a pastor, he mustered up his courage and said some words of prayers. He raised up the machete and made a cut on the trunk of the tree. Nothing happened to him. Then his courage rose. "Someone said this tree must go down," the pastor said with so much joy. "Someone said this tree must go down," the pastor said with so much joy. "This tree must go down," his fellow pastors repeated after him. Then he raised the machete high, this time around, with so much strength. He made a deep cut into the tree. He also laid out a loud cry immediately the machete landed on the tree. "Yay, my leg! My leg!" the pastor shouted in pain. His fellow pastors were surprised and all looking at him to know what had happened. The pastor looked at his trousers and it was already soaked with blood. He slowly lifted up his trousers in tears, only to see a huge cut on his leg with blood pouring out. The pastor fell on the floor and started crying out in pain. "My leg! Please help me! Oh my God!" Fear gripped the other pastors. They were scared to come close to the pastor, who was on the floor, crying in pain. They both kept pushing each other to know who was going to help the pastor. A sensational wind began to blow and the weather started changing. The atmosphere was turning dark. A strange whistle accompanied with strange whispers were heard. A man without a face walked out of the tree. The pastors left their Bible and took to their heels, leaving the senior pastor who was crying out and calling them back. Sandra was scared, but her need to see her daughter and save her husband was greater than her fear. She knelt down in front of the being in tears, in front of the faceless man that came out of the tree. "Please forgive my husband. Please, I'm so sorry. No one told us we were to dedicate our daughter to you. Please bring back our daughter and heal my husband. I will dedicate her to you, I promise." Sandra said in tears, "Blood, only blood can appease me. The blood of an innocent child. Else it dies and the child never comes back to you." The voice echoed from the tree. The faceless being turned and walked towards the tree. No, please forgive us, please. I can't lose my family. Please have mercy, please." Sandra continued pleading in tears to the faceless being, who didn't seem interested in her pleas. It walked back into the tree without uttering a word, and the climatic condition changed and everywhere became bright again. Sandra looked beside her, and the pastor, who was crying out in pain, was lying dead beside her. It seemed like he had bled out on the spot because of how deep the cut was. Sandra cried out and ran out of the land. She ran home in tears. She entered into the house with tears rolling down her cheeks. Marian stood up anxiously, trying to know what happened. "Mama, he is asking for blood. Blood of an innocent child. How can I kill someone's child for mine?" "What about the pastor?" Marian asked inquisitively. The pastor is dead. He's dead," Sandra cried out painfully. Marian carried her hands on her head. She had warned her husband to let go of the land so many years ago, but it didn't heed to her advice. All this wouldn't have happened if he let go. If the popular pastor in the village just lost his life, then who was going to save them? "Mama, I can't lose my family." You won't die, Sandra said, hugging her husband and sobbing bitterly, while Mr. Bragg just lay still and tears rolled down from the corners of his eyes. Tina let out a loud cry. She lifted Naomi up from the ground, trying to see the spot where Naomi had knocked her head. Naomi had her hands on her head and began to cry. Mr. David came back to see his wife holding Naomi, who was in tears. That was when Mr. David realized that it's the little girl he knocked down who he had taken for Pascal. He asked Tina what happened. She told him how Naomi was pushed down. Mr. David didn't waste time. He carried Naomi immediately and put her into the car. The doctor had advised them to take good care of Naomi for her to heal quickly. He had also warned that she could lose her memory permanently. He couldn't tell how he had been so careless to bring Naomi out in a public place. She was supposed to be at home for a quick recovery. He only hopes the fall won't cause any complications. As soon as he arrived at the hospital, he took her to the doctor who was in charge of Naomi's operation. He told the doctor what had happened. The doctor took Naomi in to check her out and see if there was any problem. He gave Naomi some painkillers. And carried out several tests. Mr. David and his wife were seated and waiting impatiently for the doctor to come out. They only hope that she doesn't develop another internal bleeding. They both held their hands together. After a while, the doctor came with a report. Sandra wiped up the tears that was rolling down the sides of her husband's eyes. "You won't die. You won't die. I won't let anything happen to you, okay?" she said convincingly to her husband, who just lay still without uttering a word. "Mama," Sandra called out to Miran, "do you know of any strong witch doctor? I can't let anything happen to my husband, and I can't stain my hands with blood. I don't even know where I'm going to get the blood of an innocent child," Sandra said, wiping her tears. Miran was sobbing, looking at her son's condition. Mr. Bright was lying still, without making any move. It seemed like even his lips were sealed. "I think, yes. I have heard of a strong witch doctor. I haven't visited him or know where he stays, but I know someone who can take me there. I have heard so much about his greatness. Mama, please, go get him, please. Ask for where he stays. I want my husband to be well again. Please," Sandra said. Miran immediately tied her head with a scarf and left immediately to go get the witch doctor. She left, leaving Sandra all alone with Mr. Bright. Mr. Bright was not happy his mother was going to get a witch doctor. He believed God was the only one who could get them out of the mess they found themselves. He only regretted acting in a haste. He tried so hard to tell his wife to call his mother back, but he couldn't. He couldn't move any part of his body, including his lips. The more he tried, the more the tears rolled down the side of his cheeks. Sandra, who didn't get the signs why her husband was shedding tears, tried wiping them off, but she couldn't help but join him, sobbing bitterly and hoping for the best. Miriam took quite a long time. It was already getting dark. Mr. Bright had already urinated on himself. Sandra noticed it and chained him with an old cloth she saw inside the house. Mr. Bright kept crying as his wife changed his trousers. He couldn't believe a full grown-up man like himself would urinate on his trousers without knowing. Finally, Meran came with the witch doctor to the house. With the help of his helper, Mr. Bright was brought out of the room and laid on the floor outside the house. The witch doctor stared at Mr. Bright. He stood still for a while. Then he started making some incantations continuously. After a while, he lifted something which looked like a bone tied with red ropes. He placed it perfectly on Mr. Bright's forehead. Immediately he did that, a strange whistle began to blow around the vicinity. Then, strange whispers could be heard all around the building. It got darker. Sandra knew the faceless man was coming because same thing happened earlier with the pastor. "Show your face. Show yourself," the witch doctor said out aloud and started making some incantations continuously. It began to blow whitish stuffs around the building. A strange wind carried the witch doctor high up and then allowed him fall to the ground. The witch doctor fell with a great thud to the ground. He quickly picked his things and took to his heels, running off like someone who had broken his leg. Tick-tack, tick-tack, tick-tack. A voice echoed from the wind. "Please, we are sorry. I don't know where I can get the blood of an innocent child. Please show us mercy." Cassandra kept pleading in tears as the whistling and whispers dispersed. Everywhere became calm. Mr. Bright suddenly started shaking vigorously. Sandra ran to where her husband lay and tried holding him as tears ran down her cheeks. Mr. Bright was not able to talk. His lips were bent toward a corner. Please, find a place in your heart to forgive my family for everything we are putting you through. I'm so sorry. Forgive me, Sandra, Mr. Bright said slowly with tears rolling down his cheeks. Stop it, please. Please, you are not going anywhere. What will become of me? If you want me to forgive you, then stand up. Stand up and let's go look for our charming princess. Sandra said, sobbing bitterly and dragging her husband by his shirt. Promise me you will run to God. Promise me. Promise me you will never dedicate our daughter to that thing. Mr. Bright said slowly, while Sandra kept shaking her head and sobbing painfully. Watch out for the part